Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. We exchange on timely energy issues as well on their life experience. You will learn a lot, whether you are an energy aficionado or a newbie. It's May 22, 2020, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today I'm exchanging with Heather Rock, who is the Climate Resilience Chief at Pacific Gas and Electric Company, known as PG&E, where she leads the company's efforts to bolster the resilience of its assets, infrastructure, operations, employees, and communities amid the growing risk of climate change. Hi, Heather.
Hey, Leslie.
Thank you for joining us. You have a very interesting trajectory that we will discuss later in the podcast. And now you're working for a company, PG&E, which has been at the forefront of adapting itself from climate change in a way, from the risk of climate change. And the company has been in the news a lot because of the wildfire that California experienced, especially in 2017, 2018. The company had filed for bankruptcy, part because there were many claims and liabilities. So rather than focusing on what happened, I'm thinking that many pundits have described the company as the first climate change bankruptcy, but it seems also to be the company that is the first adaptation utility. And your role is specifically dedicated to thinking about potential future risk. Can you tell us a little bit about how the company is evolving from dealing from what happened, which was a bad story, to thinking about what's next?
Yes, so it has definitely been an interesting ride at PG&E. I joined the company in October 2018, about 2 weeks before the Camp Fire. So as you can imagine, it's been an interesting time to be at PG&E, to see the change in the company's shift towards looking at things like climate risk, and how wildfire has really, I think, been a really important wake-up call, not just for the company, but also for California, and hopefully for the way that other companies and individuals think about long-term and short-term climate risk too.
Yeah.
So I joined the company's climate resilience team, which is a small team within our corporate sustainability team. And what we're trying to do is to make the company a more climate informed company. It's sort of how I like to talk about it. And what that means is that we are thinking proactively about not just the weather conditions that the company and our employees and our customers experience today and operate in, but also looking towards the future. We know we already have a lot of climate change baked into the system just because of historical greenhouse gas emissions. And so with that in mind, and knowing that greenhouse gas emissions are likely to continue increasing globally, we need to be prepared for not just the weather of today or 5 years, but also the weather that we're going to face in 2050 and beyond, and make sure that our assets, our infrastructure, our employees, our customers, and the communities in which the company serves are all prepared for this risk.
Yeah. And concretely speaking, can you give us a few illustrations so that we understand what a utility needs to think about? Is it just a matter of equipment, repositioning some power poles? When you think about the wildfire, what is the most exposed risk for a utility?
So a few years ago, PG&E did an assessment, and I will say a number of other utilities also did the same assessment to look at which were the top risks, climate risks that the companies face. And so, wildfire, of course, was one of them for PG&E, but we also look at drought, which, as you can imagine, is important for PG&E's hydroelectric system. We look at extreme heat. As we know, heat can have impacts on load. You have a few hot days and more people are cranking up their ACs, which puts more strain on the system, but also, temperature has an impact on equipment itself. We're looking at subsidence in places like California's Central Valley, We might know that there's a lot of agriculture and oil production there, but there's a lot of disadvantaged communities that live out there too. And with all the usage of groundwater and in some places oil extraction, the ground is actually sinking, and so that has impacts for equipment that's out there. Also look at extreme storms. With knowing that we're going to have more greenhouse gases and more heat trapped in the atmosphere, that means that storms are likely to become more powerful. There's going to be changes in precipitation patterns. So this is meaningful for not only equipment that might get knocked out, but also the way that you manage your dams and your hydro system. And then also thinking about sea level rise and also, and inland flooding. It's pretty clear that, we're already seeing, a few inches of sea level rise happening. And when you look at the projections towards the end of the century, there can be a possibility for a pretty significant sea level rise, and that means a lot for different coastal communities and assets that might be facing this new threat.
Very interesting. And can you explain for our listener what's the difference between adaptation and mitigation? Your role so far is more in the adaptation.
Yes, and it's funny whenever I talk about this in with a new group, I have a slide that I always show because I feel like getting these definitions out of the way is really important because it can be confusing. And so when we think about mitigation, we're thinking about what we can do as a company or you as an individual or government policies. What are we going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Whether it's replacing types of equipment, whether it's looking at energy efficiency, changing the type of energy that we use, consuming less meat, right? Those are all things that we can do to reduce emissions. And that goes under that field of mitigation. When we're thinking about adaptation and resilience, we're looking at, okay, we know that we have this trajectory for more emissions in the atmosphere, more heat and all these storms. So what are we going to do for it? What are we going to do about it? And I like to use the analogy of a seawall. While we are building a seawall, let's say around a community that's threatened by sea level rise, we're in that process of adapting. And once that seawall is in place, we can consider that community or that asset as being resilient to the long-term impact of sea level rise.
Mm-hmm. Is it still controversial, or is it controversial in the utility business to think about adaptation?
Well, I think in terms of adaptation, even if someone might come from a place where they are skeptical of climate science and like to think of that ways, you can't ignore the fact that we have much more extreme and destructive weather events happening. If you look online, I think it's NASA or NOAA, shows that the frequency of $1 billion or more disaster events has really increased in the last 20 years, right? So regardless of what you might think about what's causing climate change, we know that we're having these more frequent and costly disasters. And so I think there's a growing acknowledgement within the utility industry and hopefully within other industries as well. And I think PG&E was definitely that canary in that coal mine, that we need to be thinking about what we're going to do about the impacts of climate change. But on the mitigation side, I'm really heartened by the fact that a lot of utilities in the last couple of years have really woken up to this challenge of reducing emissions. And there have been a lot of proposals out there and commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, do things like convert, energy usage mix from more coal to less coal and more towards renewables. And so I think industry-wide, we're seeing a shift.
And I think the public opinion also, because at one point, the environmental community was thinking about mitigation adaptation also as an acknowledgement of a failure to have managed to reduce carbon greenhouse emissions and not having been able to meet the goals.
I don't think that has necessarily gone away. I've heard environmentalists and others in meetings I've been in express that sentiment that no, we can't take our eye off the ball on mitigation. We really need to focus on that. And definitely when you think about what the hot topics are in the energy sector, it's overwhelmingly mitigation, right? There's not that many places that are focusing on adaptation. I think we have to think about both, because we already know we have like 1,000 years of climate change already baked into our system. We're already seeing these impacts. So I think we need to do both. And I think we
Yeah.
need to think about the way that we adapt in a way that doesn't promote, more emissions. We call it maladaptation, right? So if you're thinking about building a microgrid, what resources are we going to use for that? And in some respects, that won't be adding more greenhouse gases into the air. And so there are things that we have to think about that bolster our resilience that don't make the broader problem worse.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I would think that it's not a California specific risk, right? And problem and issue and thinking. I would think that many utilities globally are looking at what PG&E is doing. So first, California has the most aggressive climate goals in a way, but has been also in the forefront of dealing with those issues. And I would think that many companies are looking at what you're doing as an example or as a leader in the industry.
I'm a native Californian. I'm proud of the state. I lived outside, as you know, I lived in DC and New York and Texas before coming back home. And I'm really proud to be back and in a state that is pushing these boundaries of what can be achieved. And I feel that PG&E is right alongside California in that respect of trying to be proactive, of doing that right thing with respect to how we're going to tackle this climate change risk that we have facing us. And I really do hope that the example that California and PG&E set in terms of how to mitigate and how to adapt can inspire others to think about what can be achieved, not only in a way that reduces our risk, but does it in an equitable way and brings everybody along.
Yeah. Does it exist like a council of utilities where you share best practices in this regard?
Yes, there actually is. Department of Energy has had a partnership focused on climate resilience for the last few years. I'm glad they're still around there. I think there's been a lot of good thinking at that level. And then within California, we talk a lot with the other investor-owned utilities about climate adaptation, share best practices. I think, think about wildfire. I think that we and SoCal Edison have probably learned a lot from the experience of SDG&E. And so I think there's a very collaborative approach to tackling this problem.
And globally, is there or maybe it's through the regulators that kind of share their experience, or it's not yet something on the agenda? Because I would think that many, companies, including in emerging markets or, countries that are less developed, but face major risk or of extreme weather could really benefit from looking and learning from what you're doing in California.
That's a really good point, Leslie. I know that when we did some initial research into wildfire and not just the risk we face today, but looking into the future, we did reach out to some of the utilities in Australia to get a sense of what their regulatory environment looked like, how are they thinking about the problem. And so I know there has been there have been some connections made there with other utilities, especially in the developing world. I totally agree, and that's something I hadn't thought of. I'm glad you brought that up, but I think it is something that we should pursue in terms of sharing the way that we've been thinking about things and helping them along as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Australia because we've seen this year so many wildfire that were pretty dramatic, and unfortunately, it may become more common in different regions. So why don't we switch to your personal and professional trajectory?
Sure.
So we both met at Eurasia Group in New York a few years ago, and you were at the time the lead political risk analyst on Central America and the Caribbean. And I remember you had some interesting research trips that sounded like a mix of pristine white sandy beaches and a good doses also of instability, political risk, and violence in some places. So explain us a little bit how you transition from a background more focused on economics and policy of Latin America to work for energy companies and then now a utility with a focus on climate change policy and sustainability.
Yeah, I made a pretty significant career shift. But as you were just talking about what I used to do, I have these little pangs of missing those amazing research trips to places like, Trinidad and Tobago and El Salvador. I spent a lot of time in those countries and really grew to love them. And I do miss it sometimes. Yeah, so we worked together. I was, running around Central America and thinking about how the political decisions and social trends there would affect the operating environment. And while I did that, I started working with a number of energy companies that were interested in places like oil and offshore Guyana, or looking at the power sector in El Salvador. And back then, I always liked working with the energy companies the most. Just there was so much at stake. They were in these countries for the long haul, and so there was a level of expertise they had and knowledge, and it seemed like they were very interested in what we always had to say. And so I developed some good relations and just got to know the industry. And after moving to New York and working there, I met my husband, and this was where a point where my professional trajectory had to sync with my personal one. He got into a PhD program at University of Houston, and all of a sudden I realized that I was going to be leaving New York and the East Coast and going to Texas. So I had to sort of reinvent myself. And long story short, I ended up at Chevron in Houston, and I ended up in their global security team, working with a couple of folks that we also used to work with at Eurasia Group. So we had our little EG posse in there. Did that for a couple of years, and then started to feel like I missed the bigger policy issues. I was looking more at political risk and more security trends, and I like the big policy issues. So I started looking around within the company to see what I could do in the policy and government affairs team. And long story, ended up taking a job in government affairs on the looking at international and federal climate policy. And from my perspective, it was a little bit back to the work I used to do, in the things I had really studied for in grad school at the international level. And it just felt like a good time to make that switch from being really Latin American focused to thinking about bigger policy issues. And it was my first foray into climate policy. So that was a huge learning curve. And the more I learned about it, I was just fascinated, and really, in retrospect, I'm really glad I made the switch, because as we both know, when thinking about the energy sector and the most defining issues of our time, climate change is really at the top of that list.
Right. And you mentioned the big learning curve. Was it an internal learning, or you took classes, or how did you manage to get smart about it?
A little bit of everything. I talked to as many people as I could who were experts in it, both inside the company and without. I read just, so many books and articles and things to get up to speed. There's some great trade publications that cover, climate change. And I also took a course at, I'll give a little shout out to Harvard. They have an executive program in climate change and policy making for the long term that's taught by, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name right now, but a great program there. And that really helped me, get up to speed. Those are the key ways. And then, of course, just thinking about, what are the things that incentivize policymakers to make certain decisions. That sort of harkened back to my Eurasia days.
Yeah, and then you switched again, so you joined PG&E when you moved to California.
I actually relocated with Chevron to California.
Oh, yeah.
This policy job was in San Ramon, and I did that for a few years. And after a few years, I started to really question, what I wanted to do long term. And I also had my first daughter around this time, and I had sort of a reckoning with myself where I loved the company. I think Chevron is a really well-run company with really great people, but I had to also think a lot about, where I saw the world going and what part I wanted to be contributing to. And I had to really think to myself, like, if I look at myself in 30 years or so when I retire, hopefully less than that, what is it that I achieved, right? What is it that I helped? And was it really to help drill more barrels of oil and bring more gas to market? And if I was really honest with myself, knowing about climate change, the answer was no. And so I wanted to find a place that really matched me in terms of mission and vision and thinking about the world. And when I looked at PG&E and seeing, their leadership on climate change and their support of California's climate goals, and this position in particular, I was really excited. I'm really glad I made the switch. It's been a bumpy and wild ride. Obviously, the company has been through a lot in the last year and a half. But for me, in terms of feeling like it's the right match for me, I definitely am happy where I ended up.
I mean, what you're mentioning about the kind of internal conflict that you may have between how you contribute to the company you work for versus your internal opinion and ideology, maybe. I think this is something that many young people actually that are graduating, are thinking about, and that's why many oil and gas companies have a hard time attracting human resource those days. But at the same time, some of them have made huge efforts, sometimes driven at the beginning by a PR, are trying to think ahead. Some of them might become even renewable companies, right? If they are buying all the solar and wind companies out there, buying so many of those renewable assets. We've seen Total, we've seen BP, Shell announcing some targets to try to have their own ambitious goals to reduce climate change. So you don't really believe in the goals of those big companies? Or you think it's too slow?
Oh, I wouldn't say I don't believe in the goals of places like Shell and BP and Total. And I'm so glad that they are, because, I think, critics of them will say it's baby steps, but I think they have to start somewhere. I do agree that a lot of people, I think within different organizations, often wrestle with themselves about like, why am I here? What am I doing? And does my vision and mission match that with my company? And I think it's also important to think about and this is how I often talk to myself about it, is that I can change a lot more from the inside than I can holding a sign outside, protesting. And don't get me wrong, I think, protest is important, and it's good that, the environmental community has different ways that they can try to pressure companies to change. And I think it does have some impact. But I was always committed within the company to sort of, I had a manager at Chevron. She said, Heather, if we sold Pepsi, you'd be drinking Coke. And I was always trying to be sort of that, not a naysayer, but just open it up to different perspectives, particularly on climate change. And I did have some success, and that's what really kept me going. And I think when I look at the commitments that places like Shell or others have made, I think it's great. I think they are seeing that long-term strategic vision, and they're also in a different environment politically, geographically, with being in Europe. So I think they're facing a different set of pressures. In the U.S., it's a different ballgame, I think, and that's why you have the U.S. international oil companies and the independents taking a different tact.
Actually, some US companies are in favor of a carbon price. I remember back in 2015, it started with big European oil and gas company backing up a carbon price. And then the US companies joined also. So I think it's just a matter of time, maybe, for some of them. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the way that they're looking at it is, carbon pricing is one way. And if you're trying to influence the folks in government who are going to make the decision of how to reduce emissions, carbon pricing is probably one of the more efficient ways to do it, right? Because you're sending a market or a price signal to the markets, and they'll respond. I think what's interesting now is that it seems like among a lot of folks on the left in the Democratic Party, that's not good enough. It's not far enough anymore. And so, I mean, part of me wonders if the IOCs had been at the table, or I'm sorry, if the IOCs had been at the table earlier in support of that, would that have prevented this big swing among the environmentalists? Could they have gotten a deal earlier? It's an open question.
And currently in your company, so you feel that you can proactively impact, the direction the company is going to take in terms of thinking about climate change, sustainability?
I hope so. I think we all hope that we can make those types of impacts. I'm really excited about a couple of efforts that PG&E has underway to really look hard at the future of the business and how we're going to meet California's very ambitious climate goals. And so I think early next year there will be some ideas and hopefully a roadmap of what this means for the company. I definitely sense a commitment to meeting these goals and asking and hopefully answering some hard questions about what this means for the different lines of business.
Yeah. So PG&E, is using gas, for instance. Is it something that the company is going to reconsider, or medium term, long term, think about some kind of decarbonized gas? Is there already a thinking around that?
There's a lot of discussion in California, not just within PG&E, but all the IOUs about what the future gas for California looks like. And I think we're going to have to think really big, right? Because there's a lot of infrastructure that we have to pay for. There are a lot of people for which gas might be the most affordable option for now. And there's affordability issues. And then of course, with wildfire seasons, and when we talk about increasing electrification, what does that mean if we have more and more people who are building out in vulnerable areas? So, and then of course, new technologies are going to be important too, right? What is the future of renewable natural gas? What's the future of carbon capture and storage? Are these going to be viable alternatives for California? I think all of that is up in the air right now.
Yeah, you raised affordability, and this is something I know New York State is looking very, that's a big component that you cannot overlook, especially when you have low-income families, in the state that rely on affordable energy. And so you mentioned your daughter earlier, and I know you have 2 kids now, but so do you feel more at peace now between, your work and what story you will tell them later, explaining them your job and your contribution to our planet?
I do. I feel I don't have that sense of conflict. I really feel a sense of purpose now that I'm doing something tangible that's going to help them. And my mission now is to make this company I work for more proactive and to reduce our risk. And when I look at the climate conditions that my children are going to face in 30, 50 years, it's really scary. And I want to make sure I've done everything I can to protect them by making the system that they rely on for their energy more resilient to what they're going to face. So yeah, I feel good.
Great. Well, so we'll end on this very optimistic note. Heather, thank you so much for joining Energy Vista podcast.
Great. Thanks.
That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on May 22nd, 2020. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck.